All right. Thank you, everyone, for joining us here today. This is the third iteration of our conversations with people in books and book authors that we've done with the Culture Catalyst Book Club. For those of you that are new to this, basically, the Culture Catalyst Book Club is a virtual book club that's free, so you can get the books anywhere you want. And it's something we're running with Take Back Work, my culture consultancy. And what we're doing is we're reading together so that we develop the skills and vocabulary to make positive change at work, one book at a time. And today I'm really thrilled to share with you that we've got Sean Heritage here. He was featured in chapter 8 of Multipliers. And later, around 5:30 or so, we're going to have Liz Wiseman jump in, and she's going to answer our questions and give us a little bit of the backstory behind Multipliers as well. So a little bit of intro to how I met Sean. Basically, I think I was stalking Sean like in the virtual world through LinkedIn and everything for quite some time before I got access to meeting him in person. We were both in the military. We served as one of the same big agencies in the DoD. And I was just really struck with Sean's ability to put into words all of these different things about the kind of culture that I wanted to live, especially while I was in the military. And so he's kind of a mythical creature. And one day when we were both living in California, I got the chance to meet him. And so that's kind of how we started. So Sean, I wanted to give you a little bit of time to tell us about yourself. You've had an amazing background. You've worked at the Defense Innovation Unit, Experimental. You're a TEDx speaker. You're working in Silicon Valley right now. But fill in the gaps for us. Tell us a little bit that you don't usually share with others.
So I love. First, thank you for having me today. It's wonderful to have reason to do something more official with you. I mean, our partnership has been rather informal over the years, and I think that I've been as big of a fan of yours as you seem to have been of mine. So it's wonderful to do something visible with you. That whole question, tell us about yourself, I think is a very telling. How you answer that is very telling, right? I think that a lot of people migrate straight toward what it is that they do, as opposed to who they are. So I like to say that the first and foremost, I am a husband. I've been married to my wife for 24 years now. I am a father. We have a 16-year-old boy. He's largely the reason why we still live here in Silicon Valley. And I used to say I happen to be a naval officer, but I don't happen to be that anymore. But my profession has always been my third priority, and it remains that. But I am, beyond being a husband and a father, I'm a committed team player. I love to build teams. I love to, what I call, connect silos, and stimulate both critical and creative thought, as a leader, as a friend, as a peer, in whatever capacity. And I like to do my best to make sense of the world around us and frame it in a different way. So when I was blogging, that was what I would do. I would talk about what I thought was the obvious and kind of frame it somewhat differently. And there was a quote that I really enjoyed, and it resonates with me. I can't even say the guy's name who said it. It's Dr. Albert Szent-Györgyi, something along those lines. But he says, discovery is seeing what everybody else has seen and thinking what nobody else has thought. And I think that those of us who have migrated toward this book club, those of us who are so committed to culture within an organization, can identify with that feeling that we see the same things that our friends do, but we think about them a little bit differently. And we want to inspire change more often than not within the teams that we are on. So that's a little bit about me.
I love that. You've captured so many things so succinctly, but just in a way that gives me the warm fuzzies. And that's probably why we're friends now.
Yeah.
So I am very, very curious about this question. I want to know, how do you end up in a book like Multipliers? Tell us a little bit about how that happened.
So much like you and this book club, I like to read. Everybody that's online right now, everybody that watches this likes to read. Reading together is usually more fun, right? Talking through things. But I recognize that most of the world doesn't read. So one of the things that I did when I was a commanding officer was I would share a book abstract every week. Every Thursday, I would share a book abstract, knowing that people won't read a book, but they might read a 3-page summary of a book. And then I would frame the lessons or the messages of that book and relate it to the command, what it is we were going through. So one week I picked multipliers, and the message really resonated with me, and it resonated with a large portion of the team. So, and I think we'll talk about it a little bit later. It's mentioned in the book. I have a personal board of directors, and the gentleman who I've designated the president of my PBOD said, "Hey, Sean, this is a really good. Have you ever thought about reaching out to the author?" And I said, "No, I really haven't. I mean, I'm busy. She's busy. Why would she want to talk to me?" But one thing led to another. I sent her a note, and she became a mentor of mine. We had a nice, healthy dialogue. I was able to talk through problems with her, and it had somewhat of a friendship over time. It just so happened that this gentleman who's on my PBOD encouraged me to talk to him. His name's Mike Lambert, and he ended up helping Liz rewrite chapter 1 of her latest edition of the book. So Liz, like so many other people, so many other leaders, so many other multipliers out there, are eager to connect with people and very responsive. So as we got to know each other better, and I was confiding in her some of the challenges that I went through, she wanted to learn more about my frustrations at then U.S. Cyber Command. And then I shared them in a story that she thought was compelling enough to say, "Hey, that's how you deal with diminishers." And if you look at her first edition of the book and this latest one, that's the biggest difference, was the addition of that chapter. So I think the lesson for me and the lesson for so many others is just make yourself available. You'd be amazed at how responsive people are. So similar stories, not necessarily didn't get my way into a book, but David Marquette, similar path. Simon Simic, Adam Grant. People are very receptive, and you've seen that yourself with who's choosing to participate and do these videos with you.
Right. It's actually incredible. I think sometimes we build up these barriers in our head and think, oh, they'll never reach back out to me, or they don't have time to answer my email. But if you craft it well, and if it's compelling enough, and if maybe you have a shared connection, really the sky's the limit for that stuff. And I guess never underestimates the impact of being able to share with somebody that their book, something that they've spent a lot of time on researching, doing all of that, has made an impact in your life. Like people still want to hear that. It's feedback. It's good feedback.
Yeah, absolutely. I think another good example, and it goes back to our first coffee that you and I shared out here in Menlo Park, was you facilitated a conversation I was able to have with somebody who I deeply admired, Tina Seelig, right? And I had a wonderful conversation with her, and it was just beautiful, right? Because I'd listened to her, I read all her books, I've listened to her on Entrepreneur Thought Leaders at that podcast, and again, it's another testament of how accessible people can be.
Absolutely. So I have a couple questions from some of the stuff you've said. One is, you mentioned that you were sharing these abstracts with your team, and you shared quite a few of them since you were doing it weekly. What do you think it was about multipliers that really resonated with people?
Well, I think that it was nice packaging, right? It was very nicely packaged, and the idea of diminishers really resonated, because there are diminishers in this world who probably know that they are, but the real thought about accidental diminishers and giving us all reason to think about, whoa, I don't think of myself as a diminisher, but what might I be doing to accidentally diminish others? Right. So I think that it inspired reflection, self-reflection.
Right. I'm excited about that, because I'm going to drop that link into our Facebook and LinkedIn groups, because having a quiz, having some different way to relate to the material and identifying your accidental diminisher tendencies is really, really helpful stuff,
Yeah. And I will tell you, for me, I tend to be a rather empowering leader. I used to talk about competence over collar device, really kind of diminish the rank structure, so to speak. And one of the feedbacks I got at the back end of my first command tour was that I was accidentally diminishing the chief petty officers, so the E7s, and the first class, petty officers first class, the E6s, because I was so fixated on making sure that everybody felt they had a voice, that the fact that some of the E4s and E5s were voices were resonating so loudly because they had great ideas, that the unintended consequence was diminishing the voices of those who felt that they had earned it based on rank. So that was good feedback for me.
Yeah, but like, how do you address that too? That must have been an interesting conversation.
Well, it was, but again, I think that you got to really listen to feedback, right? So I didn't get defensive. Like, what do you mean? How could they think that? Like, huh? Mm-hmm. I accidentally made people feel that way, and that I was disheartened by that, because that was not my intent, right? My intent was to make sure that everybody felt as though their opinions mattered and that they had a voice, regardless of rank. But when you in a military structure, those more senior oftentimes are conditioned to think that their voice matters more than others.
Yep, definite fact.
Yeah.
So I'm going to ask you one more question, and then I want to give some time and space for everybody else to pepper you with a few. So everybody that's got some questions for Sean, be thinking of them, be ready. But here's my question. It's kind of a chicken or the egg question, because what I'm getting the sense of is that Chapter 8 was added as a result of Liz hearing your story. So is the dealing with diminishers, was that just your natural, intuitive way of dealing with diminishers, and then the chapter got built out as a result of that? Or were you just, how did you know how to tackle the accidental diminishers? There's a couple
things. I don't know that I knew how to do it. I think that I just went with my intuition. And after the fact, it seems so obvious. So the book doesn't overstate the fact that I was getting ready to leave the Navy. I was so disheartened with the situation, and I prided myself on really loving my work. Right. And I wasn't loving my work, so it's time to find work that I loved. And going back to the philosophy of, be the leader you wish you had, mm-hmm. or be the leader your team deserves. Right. I felt the responsibility, and there was some inspiration provided by my juniors, like, hey man, if you leave, what's going to happen to the rest of us? Right. So, trying to be the leader that I wish, in this case, the colonel was, gave me reason to amplify who I was as a leader, and kind of compensate for the things that I wish he would be doing. And then, I am a visual person, and the work environment matters greatly to me. So when we started bringing artwork into the spaces, and triggers to remind people about what we wanted our culture to be, there were some eye rolls, like, why are you doing this? This is a military environment. It has no place for creativity, because it's kind of, I have some of the artwork on my wall right now. It's kind of out there, especially in a military environment. So no, I think it was intuition. It definitely wasn't rehearsed. There was no focus groups. It was just me being my authentic self and acting in a way that I wish the diminisher would.
And it seems like it worked, because it kind of caught on. And here we have a question over here in the chat, so we can read it together. And this is from Rob from Slater. So question A, critical thinking and creative thinking are some of my current favorite areas of study. Do you use any particular model, and can you recommend any favorite books, courses, etc. on either side? Plus, he got excited when you said Cyber Command.
Yeah. Okay, good. So yeah, Cyber Command's a great place. So off the top of my head, I think that critical thinking and creative problem solving are cultivated through questions. So a wonderful book that I enjoyed, A More Beautiful Question, about how do leaders give others reason to think and kind of tease out the answers. Not to say that we already know the answers and we're trying to get them to say what we know to be true, but really priding ourselves on asking the right questions that inspire others to think, and then at the same time own the answers and solutions. So to me, it's conditioning, especially in the military, because there's so many standard operating procedures and instructions to read and checklists to follow that we kind of condition people not to think. So I think that through questioning, you recondition that behavior to give people reason to think. So, whether it's the 5 whys and have people arrive at the answer or an answer that they can actually own. I think that's worked for me in the past, and it seems to resonate with the team.
Absolutely. That's great. We have another question from Aaron, and he asks, what are some success stories you can share around seeing people shift from being a diminisher to a multiplier?
Wow. I think I can't point to anybody who knew that they were a diminisher that became a multiplier. I think that there are people who realize that they were accidental diminishers, because there are just mean people out there. Let's face it. But accidental diminishers becoming a multiplier. So I would say that in this situation, the colonel that I worked with, who at his retirement ceremony allowed us to give him a creative, he's an Air Force guy. We had side boys. We gave him a Navy send-off. He had Legos at the podium when he was giving his speech. Things that were very uncharacteristic of him, 6 months or a year prior to. And just the validation that his behaviors had visibly changed, that felt good. It felt right. So he's an example of somebody who shifted once that it was once he realized, or it was pointed out, that he was diminishing the rest of us. But somebody's got to want to change, right? Somebody's got to see what right looks like. So again, it's through examples that we and others incentivize, shine the light on, or cultivate.
I love that portion of the book where Liz was talking about level 1 and level 2 tactics that you can use, and just pointing out whenever somebody's doing something that is positive, that's a shift in the right direction, just making sure they know that you appreciate it and you see them. That goes a long way, because we're conditioned by all of the things that have happened in the past. And so if you've been an accidental diminisher or something like that, it can take just as long to shift to the next level to be a multiplier.
Yeah, and so that's another thing on that. I mean, how are you incentivizing and shining the light on things? How are you showing others what right looks like? In the past, I would give out bobbleheads for people who made the values come to life, or were exhibiting behaviors that made sense. And then I got some other treats, if you will, artifacts that people can put on their desk or show that say, hey, I'm part of the tribe. I'm exhibiting this culture. I am multiplying. Be like this guy or this gal.
I like that, because even after you've said it, even if it's after the fact, people might say, what's that bobblehead about? Tell me more about that. What's the story behind it? And there's something really powerful about stories and creating legends and just all of these examples that people can relay to each other over time. So what other questions are out there? I know there've got to be a few more. Okay, this one's from Josh. You guys are doing great today, so thanks. Keep that up. What kind of experiences have you had with diminishers who refuse to abandon their diminishing behaviors? What ended up happening to that person? Were they removed, or were they allowed to finish the term of their contract or position?
So visible accountability matters. So I'll point to some examples of juniors on my team who were diminishers. Some may have known it, some didn't, but those who didn't change were held to account. Not in a way that would embarrass them, though I did relieve at least one person who was holding back the entirety of their team, because we as leaders are the lid of our organization, as John Maxwell would say. So I think as a leader, it's much easier for us to hold juniors to account, because what is the if you don't do anything, you're sanctioning the behavior.
Right.
So you have to do something. So it's equal parts amplifying what is good and great around you, and then holding those to account for the less than optimal behavior that you're seeing. And we know it's much more difficult in government civilian world, but it has to happen, right? It happens differently. In the military, it's pretty easy to make happen, provided you are willing to do it. And I've seen it already in the 6 months I've been in the civilian world, where there's people who box their stuff up, at a moment's notice, right? Because they weren't meeting the mark. I mean, there's a high level of accountability in the civilian world that I'm realizing rather quickly.
Yeah, it's right. It's definitely a shift from working in government service for sure. So here's another question from Aaron. I love it. Tips on how to handle working for a diminisher, asking for a friend.
Yeah, so I mean, it sounds trite, but I would say just read the first few pages of chapter 8 in the book. You got to do something, and you got to recognize the environment around you. And I think there's tailored answers based on the environment. Maybe you have another individual on your team who's willing to partner with you, because you don't want to be that lone nut. You got to get everybody else dancing too.
Yeah.
And that takes a while.
That's a great point. I've dealt with some higher ranking diminishers in my career too. And sometimes I realized that it wasn't something I could go alone. And almost that, one of the things I decided to do, because I could see the impact of this diminisher's behavior on other people, is go to the leaders that I trusted, people that would be on my personal board of directors, and say, hey, we're strong. We can take this abuse, but what happens when there's somebody that can't? Let's appeal to our collective leadership. And it would be scary to go this alone, but maybe together we can live up to what we believe is right as leaders. And that actually worked really well. When faced with that, people just thought, yeah, you're right. I don't want to have to call somebody's parents someday and tell them something happened to their kid because they were working in a toxic environment. And I knew it and I didn't stop it.
Yeah.
So that worked really well, to be honest.
Yeah. And sometimes too, you are shielding the rest of the team from the diminisher, right? Just because your leader is a diminisher doesn't mean that that leader has to impact those under your charge, right? So how are you protecting them? Advocating on their behalf, but also being the sponge of the quote unquote abuse.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I also really like some of the advice in the book about really figuring out, why are they behaving that way? If they're a micromanager, is it because you have a different way of looking at the world and they're not getting the information they need from you? And if you can solve that problem, can you alleviate some of those symptoms of their diminisher qualities? So,
absolutely.
So what else do you guys have? Let's see. Feel free to pop in, whether it's chat or get your voice and your face on there. No. Okay, oh yeah, Rob had a second question that I forgot to scroll back up to. Okay, he struggles with the military structure piece because we suck at communication. How did you empower your folks knowing that they didn't have all the info? I feel like our communication is an accidental diminisher, but overcoming something like that. Sorry, Rob, I hope I didn't butcher your question.
Yeah, so I would agree that every team sucks at communicating. Every team can do better with communicating. So, one of the things that I always prided myself is over communicating the why, giving people as much context as possible. And that's not complete transparency, but that's giving them what they need in order to understand why we are doing something. And sometimes, just as I mentioned earlier, sometimes you don't want to tell them everything because you are protecting them from reality in some cases. So no, I think we should all err on the side of over communicating why we are doing things, and what we are attempting to accomplish. Uh, for the biggest reason being is that they'll be helpful in navigating the how, right? So if we know what we got to do, we think we know what we have to do and why we're doing it. The how is so extremely important, but we aren't necessarily the best people to define how. So I like to compartmentalize conversations. Again, like Simon Sinek, so you start with why, then you talk about what, and then you be really inclusive in the how. And that's where I am right now on my current team as we define the strategy or finalize the strategy for 2020. We focused on what we are doing, why we are doing it, and hey, everybody, let's huddle up and figure out how to do it, how to get it done. Because that's how you get that execution going, right? It's General McChrystal, shared consciousness and empowered execution. So if they don't have shared consciousness, there's no way that they're going to be able to execute without oversight.
Earlier we were talking about how when you read all of these books, you see these themes overlapping, and it's kind of like the same messages over and over again. But I would also like to foot stomp the purpose piece. It's so crucial. And one of the things, I do these talks on psychological safety, and purpose is key. And what happens is people don't realize if you're not explicit about the purpose, then people fill in the dots for themselves. And you could be operating with 10 different ideas of why you're doing something on a small team, and that just pulls you in so many different directions. So much better to be explicit about it. Make sure you're operating from that common understanding. You can't take that for granted.
Not at all. Not at all. I know you wanted to say his name, but you didn't. You were talking about Daniel Pink, probably, right? The autonomy, mastery, and purpose, right? And that's what everybody wants, to be motivated. And I was talking with a colleague just yesterday about how do you give people autonomy. It's kind of funny. She was struggling with autonomy in the military, where I never struggled with autonomy. I always struggled with the ability to develop mastery. I never felt like the military afforded you that opportunity.
I could see that. One question as we get ready to transition over, we're still waiting on Liz here for those of you that are in. What are you doing now? Like, you've given us some clues about how the themes from multipliers are showing up in your life, how you're building teams and working through that. But what are the big projects that we should see from Sean in 2020?
So things that I enjoy doing. So my wife will call me predictable. I prefer consistent. So consistent, what am I doing? I am leveraging my geography, living here in Silicon Valley, to do what I love doing, bringing the public and private sectors together. So whether that's my role on the community advisory at the Defense Entrepreneurs Forum, whether that's helping senior DoD officials plan visits out here in the Valley, whether that's help my current company solve national security problems, that's what I do. Right. So I do that on the side, and I specifically chose a company that was going to allow me to do that as my primary employment. So I work at a small cyber company in Redwood Shores, underneath the shadows of the big Oracle buildings. And I am the only federal guy out here on our team. And I love that. So again, bringing those two worlds together in any and every way that I can.
That's fantastic. It's almost like you found ways to embed the multipliers aspect, not just at work, but in your life.
Well, yeah. So I would equate, the work on DEF is kind of talent magnet type things. Another thing that I love doing, not that I've completed my transition, because I think the military transition is a long journey, but is investing in others, being an investor multiplier by coaching military members through that transition. And I think that the authenticate role that I specifically chose, allows me to be a challenger and really magnify the teachings of Liz's other book, or one of her other books, Rookie Smarts, right? Because in so many ways, I'm a rookie. And I'm loving that, right? So I bring the new, fresh ideas that may not have the right context, but not holding back on sharing those ideas and asking those questions.
Fantastic. So I guess part of the other question is, what are you reading now?
Oh, I'm reading I'm doing less reading. I'm doing more audiobooks.
Okay.
Um, the Rise of
That's
Capital
the same in our
Surveillance.
thing.
Yeah, the Rise of Capital Surveillance is what I'm reading. And part because of my job, it is really focused on publicly available information and open source intelligence platform. Part of it is because I live a mile from the Googleplex. And then just the news about the privacy that we continue to give up. Though we talked about it before we started recording, I've been reading so much of the same things that I needed to branch out a little bit from that, from the traditional self-development, leadership development things. So that's what I'm listening to right now. But the last book that I finished, it was probably well aligned with this group, was The Infinite Game by Simon Sinek, which I think is a model or a mindset that is not all that prevalent in the military. You know, we like to lead up until our PRD and then move on. And then our relief will go do something else because they need to get their fitness report, a good fitness report, and get promoted and all that stuff. So I think that the military is filled with finite thinkers. So it was a wonderful book.
Excellent. Well, thank you for sharing all of this insight and wisdom. And guess who we've got with us now? We've got Liz. There she is. Hey. We can't quite hear you yet. I think we muted everybody on their way in. So
All right, I will mute myself. Hi, Liz.
Hi, Sean. It's so good to see you and your wall of optimism behind you. That's nice.
excellent. Well, we are so excited to have you here today, Liz. Sean has just been sharing with us all kinds of things, including how he found himself in chapter 8 of Multipliers, tips for dealing with diminishers, and all of that good stuff. So I sent you some questions in advance, but I just wanted to share with everybody how I met you, which just so happened to be through Sean. Sean was the one that made the connection, and it's been about 2 years or so since we've talked, but since then, I've started a company called Kickback Work, and one of the things we do is a free book club. And everybody that you see here today, for the most part, is a member. And December was the Multipliers month. So we have been on an incredible journey over the past year, and everybody so far that's read this, we're only 18 days into the month, has really, really enjoyed it. So we're so excited to have you here today.
Oh, thanks for making time, everyone, to read the book. And you know, when you write a book, you just hope somebody reads it. So it really always warms my heart when people say, "Oh, I bought your book." I'm like, "Oh, that's great, but did you read it?" So thank you if you have found time to do that, particularly in a busy month for a lot of people. So I'd be happy to talk with you about it, answer your questions. Val, I saw your questions. I thought they were fun, and I'm happy to share some thoughts on that or go wherever the group wants to go.
So I'll ask you a couple just to set the stage. We have people popping stuff into the chat here and there throughout the thing. But one of the things that struck me from our first conversation, I think I asked you what it was like to write a book. And you said something that stuck with me over the past 2 years. And you said there are big ideas books and thoughts I had while sitting on the toilet kind of books. I know I'm embarrassing you right now, but I thought it was hilarious. So could you walk us through that and how Multipliers came to be? All of the work that went into that.
Sure. You know, and I can't really take any credit for the thoughts I had while on the toilet, because it was actually something a friend of mine said. I would call him a fellow author, but I don't consider myself a peer of his. Carrie Patterson, who wrote the Crucial Conversations series and Influencer, he's the one who said, "Yeah, you know, like, Liz, it's clear you've done your homework for this book." He said, "So many books I see are thoughts people had while in the bathroom." So he didn't quite say toilet, but you know the point. And so I'll share a little bit of just the journey of writing the book. It started with an observation and a question, and then an unanswered question. So I left Oracle with this question, and I was doing some executive coaching and talking to someone who, I think I might have written about this in the book, but talking to someone who was very, very smart. And, had a pedigree education, but he was struggling because he was shutting down people on his team. And in the coaching process, and just as part of that natural coaching conversation, I was talking to him about this idea about how, like, it seemed to me that some people had this kind of viral intelligence, like their intelligence was contagious. Other people got smart around them. And I was describing this, saying that you could be one of these kind of leaders. And, he was like, oh, I get it. Like, what you're saying is these are people who amplify the intelligence. Like, that's what I hear you saying. And I'm like, well, yeah, it's kind of an amplification, but I see it as a sort of multiplication. And that's where the idea was really born. And I went out, I'm a researcher by heart, and I went out looking for research. Like, clearly someone has done research on this, and I found that no one had, and it was really surprising. So I decided to do the research. And when I went to go write a book, it was then I ran into, or I reached out to my friend Carrie Patterson, who had written a number of what I thought were great books. And he said, Liz, don't be an idiot. And he's like, don't write a small book. Don't write a warm-up book. Don't treat this like your first book and just write a book and hope a few people read it. Don't treat it as a calling card book, just like, oh, here's a few thoughts I had about leadership, and you ought to hire me to be your coach because I've written a few things down. He said, you go write a big book. And he said, it's a big idea. Go write a big book, and, a New York Times bestseller book. And I didn't know what to do with that, but it was Carrie who really helped me see that it's easy to just say, okay, here's a few thoughts I had, but I had done a lot of research, and he really challenged me to just go big and not just do something mediocre. And so it was kind of the kick in the pants from Carrie that helped me set my sights on this. And there's more to the story, but that's a little bit.
Oh, I love it. And you'll also be excited to know that Crucial Conversations is on our book list for 2020. I think it's February or March. So we're starting out early in the year with developing key skills. So.
Wonderful. Well, Carrie Patterson is the lead author for this. I worked for him. If you get far enough into Multipliers, there's a story about him in chapter, I think it should be chapter 6. It's one of my favorite stories. But he was really very much an inspiration to me.
That's fantastic. Oh, thank you for sharing some of that backstory. I have to say that one of the things I love about Multipliers is how practical it is. It is a handbook, I feel, with all of the different things that you've added in there. I even have a printout of just pages 208 and 209 where you talk about the accidental diminishers, and then you have a chart for how to practice working on counteracting these habits that we have. And what led you to put that level of detail into the book? Because it would be easy to just talk about it, but what made you go the extra step?
Well, I think two reasons. One is I've read a lot of management books, and I wanted to write a kind of book of the kind that I appreciate, which are, they have chapter summaries. They don't read just like novels, that they actually are chunked in a way that's very easy to process, easy to refer back to, and they're practical. That, like, I love a mind stretch as well as anyone else, but I love a mind stretch that also encourages you to go and do something with that. So I was very much inclined that way based on my own reading, but also prior to this, like, so I wasn't ever a little girl who grew up and wanted to be an author. Like, this had not crossed my mind until I'm in that moment with that executive, and I'm realizing nobody has really done research on this, and I need to be helpful to him, and maybe I can be helpful to more, like maybe I should go and do this research. It wasn't until that moment that I decided, well, I need to write this book. And prior to that, I had spent 17 years as a operating manager that, now I teach leadership, but, for almost 2 decades, I had spent my career leading an education function. So I was leading the teachers and, like, I've had to do a lot of the hard things of management. And so it's like in my nature to want to do something that managers can actually do something with. Like it never occurred to me not to do that. And the second edition has a greater level of specificity, and it has more tools. I love that you noticed the charts on page 208, 209. Like I know that number because I think that that's like one of the most helpful things in the book is you'll find it on page 208, 209. And then Appendix E is where I put a lot of the tools. And the way that came about is I'd written multipliers. Those tools weren't in there because I hadn't created them yet. And then in the process of teaching, I'm creating these tools. And I was working on a second edition of the book, and I was looking for kind of a diverse set of stories. This is actually for the work I was doing on a book for education. I was looking for kind of a diverse set of examples. And I thought, well, I need people to go and experiment with these ideas and to, really experiment with the ideas the way they were intended. And I'm thinking, well, what could I do that would be helpful to people? And I thought, well, rather than just sort of guide them, maybe I could be more clear. And so I decided to just write up, here's exactly what I want you to go and experiment with. Like, go try this thing. And it happened to be on a Friday afternoon that I had this aha, which is, oh, well, rather than wish people good luck being a multiplier, maybe I should give them some really clear direction. And it was a Friday afternoon, and it was Memorial Day weekend. And what was important is this is right at the part in our family's evolution where our kids have decided they don't need parents anymore. Like they're now teenagers, they have friends of their own, they have social lives, and it's Memorial Day weekend. And my husband and I are thinking, oh, what are we going to go do with the kids? And we find out, oh, well, she's got plans with this friend, and this one's been invited to this. And really, our kids don't need us or want us on Memorial Day weekend. And so I had this clear weekend, and I thought, well, I'll just spend the weekend like creating this little toolkit. And so I did. There was a need, and I had the time. And the tools have, I think, been helpful to a lot of people. So if you haven't gotten that far, Appendix E has all those tools. And we, it's what we used to do. It's what we include in our training. And I thought, well, why not just to give it to everyone? Like,
Right.
I want it to be practical and useful, not just for people who have the time to go to a workshop, but for everyone. So I just said, we're putting it all in the book. So that's it.
Well, thank you. I think all of us appreciate being able to just jump straight to that and have something to test out. So it's one of my favorite things about the book. And everybody's been waiting for you. So we have a couple questions already lined up for you. This one is from Josh. He says, Liz, I'm curious, what were some of the major standout moments for you during your research for the book?
Well, I'll tell you about my moments of panic. So there was a number of surprises. I'd say probably a third to a half of what I had hypothesized were like the secret ingredients for these multiplier leaders. I'd say about a third to half of them, I was dead wrong. So those are moments I remember running, wow. Like I expected that these multiplier leaders would have good facilitative skills. You know how you think of people who are good at facilitating? Not at all correlated. And so, some of my guesses were wrong. The moments of panic or insight might have been that realization that most of the diminishing that's happening is accidental. That when I started the research, maybe I had a hyped up sense of mission, but there were these like amazing multipliers and then these like dastardly diminishers. Like there were good leaders and bad leaders, and it was so clear and almost like I was on a mission to rid the world of bad bosses and, like villains, kind of villain bosses. And then you realize, wow, like actually, it's kind of like a moment in a movie where you realize, like a really good movie where kind of like that, the usual is it unusual suspects or usual suspects?
I think it's usual. Maybe
usual suspects, yeah. Because it's really about unusual suspects. That movie is like where you realize, wow, maybe the good guys are actually the bad guys. That most of the diminishing that's happening is coming from well-intended leaders. So that was a clear moment of realization. Another moment of realization was seeing over and over how few of the abject diminishers really understood the effect they were having on people. Now, I started the research here. I live in the heart of Silicon Valley, and you know, as just like several of us, and started the research in tech companies. And a number of the, like, my research was in essence asking people to identify a diminisher and a multiplier in their work history. And as they're identifying diminishers, a lot of them are people I know and people I see around town. And so people would ask me what I was working on. I would tell them, and they'd be like, oh, that's a great concept. I love this idea of multipliers. I'm such a multiplier leader. Like, that's me. That's how I lead. And I'm thinking, that's not at all how the people who work for you experience you. Because some of these people that I would run into socially, people I knew at companies or clients, they were the subject of my diminisher interviews. And they would have been shocked to know that.
That's
like,
yeah, that's like kind of mind blowing, and what a small world, and how sometimes our self-awareness is just not where it needs to be.
Oh, and I remember this one case where these two women I had worked with, they'd each come to me and talked about, oh, I read your book, and oh yeah, like so-and-so is such a diminisher. And then that same person had had that same conversation with me about the other person, and neither of them are seeing their own diminishing side. That was interesting. And I'll tell you, maybe one of the most surprising moments was I was doing some of the, I was just yesterday down on the Apple campus, and it was reminding me that I did a lot of my interviews there in that first round. And I interviewed someone, and he talked about someone who was a diminisher to him, total diminisher. You know, I'm taking my notes, doing the interview. And then about a week later, I'm interviewing somebody else on that same team. And I ask him for a diminisher and a multiplier in his experience. And he talks about that same person as his multiplier. He's like, oh yeah, like that person brought out the best in me, and I just did all this great work. And I'm like, whoa, 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 whoa. That person's a diminisher. So I have him in my, you know, sort of taxonomy. It's like, that's a diminisher, that person. And now you're describing him as a multiplier, and then I'm having this existential like crisis as a researcher, like maybe this is all flawed and I'm not doing this right, and I'm not thinking about this right. And it was this moment that the same manager can have a diminishing effect on one and an absolute multiplying effect on another. And probably has a lot to do with the assumptions that leader holds about those two people. And, you know, help me see how situational this is and how individual it is. And that, you know, they're really, all of this, I think the common theme across all of it is that it's not relevant or really even interesting or useful to categorize someone as a multiplier or a diminisher. The more interesting question is, what situations bring out your inner diminisher?
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, what are situations that prompt you into becoming an accidental diminisher? Are there times of the quarter or the business cycle that brings out your diminisher? Are there certain people that bring out that diminishing side to us? You know, what are the situations that bait that in us? That to me is a far more interesting question to ask.
I love that. It's just so interesting to realize that, like you're saying, it can all be situational, and maybe as a result of training where you're more aware of these specific behaviors that can be diminishing, you can actually open up conversation for a team where you can get data about what's working and what's not, because otherwise those conversations may not be happening.
Mm-hmm.
So very interesting. All right, we have
and in some ways you want, if I could add on to that, I'll try to do it quickly. You know, sometimes I get people who take the accidental diminisher quiz and say to me, oh, hey Liz, I took the quiz and good news, like I'm not a diminisher or I'm not an accidental diminisher. I'm like, oh, So you took the self-assessment. I'm like, okay, so what that says is you don't think you're an accidental diminisher. In some ways, you want a high score on that, because what that means is you see it. And, you know, if you see it, then you can be watching for it, and you can watch for things that trigger it, like, ooh, silence tends to trigger my always on behavior, or crisis moments triggers my rescuer. And the more you can see it, the more you can talk about it with your team. The more you talk about it with the team, the more your team can go, Liz, hey, you know what? I don't need a rescue. I got this. I know you totally want to help. I got this. I'll get it across the finish line. It'll be done. And I'm like, oh, great. So like seeing it is what you want.
That's a great point too. We're also putting the link for the Accidental Diminisher quiz in our Facebook and LinkedIn group. So hopefully everybody here will be taking that and maybe finding out some interesting things about themselves. That'd be good. Switching gears a little bit, I have a question from Rob, and he confesses that he's only halfway through. That's okay. We're only halfway through the month. So he noticed that there were different leadership models that he was jumping around with. Situational, servant, transformational leadership, and he felt that each model was used in some capacity throughout the case studies and research. So the question is, do you think there is any particular model that fits the overall multiplier thesis, or are you potentially building a new model?
I was not ever intending to build a new model, and in fact, I was pretty careful in my research and the framing that I wasn't trying to do that. Some people pushed me that direction. I said, no, I am studying something actually very narrow. I'm studying the effect that leaders have on people's intelligence. And so I kept it out of trying to be this, like, here's what a great leader does, like a competency model. And in trying to answer that narrow question, I think what I found is that it turns out to be a fairly comprehensive leadership model. I think that's the way a lot of other people have experienced it. I wouldn't say it's a be-all, end-all, but it covers most of the ground of what a great leader needs to do. Doesn't include, like, here's like some transactional skills on how to have a difficult conversation, a crucial conversation, or how to give really candid feedback. But in terms of a broad brush of here are the things that you have to get right, I think I think a lot of people say it turns out to be kind of like a new model.
I could see that.
But I see, you know, to this point about like servant leadership, these are all things that, and situational leadership, I think a lot of people have made connections to those and find them very compatible. I'm not a wine drinker, but like this idea that it pairs well with certain things. It's like, so there's a number of things that multipliers pairs well with. It pairs well with servant leadership. It pairs well with situational leadership. It pairs well with radical candor. And there's several more.
And I see that. And I think part of that is because of the research and how much you had to struggle with the data and figure out what story it was really telling. And when you get to that, you get to some element of truth. And as long as other people are doing that as well, it makes sense that they would pair well together.
Yeah.
So looking at the time, I realized we're so close to the top of the hour. I just wanted to see if you had any final thoughts for us, if you wanted to tell us a little bit about what you're working on right now, maybe share some words of wisdom before you have to sign off.
You know, I want to respond to this question from Galaxy Note 10. I don't know who that is, but
That's Josh. Yes.
Hi, Josh. That we actually did some study on this, and I am embarrassed to say I can't remember the exact data around introversion and extroversion, but I will say what I do remember is that being an introvert is not a liability that you have to overcome to be a good multiplier leader. I remember the data being skewed towards, not that introverts were more likely to be multipliers, but way more likely than you would believe. Like there's some certain magic that comes with being an introvert, is maybe it helps you not take over a room. It helps, like, this idea of, like, sometimes you have to be big as a leader and sometimes you have to be small. Like, so there's some real nice virtues there. I will say that we did find that in many ways, diversity of intellectual and mental styles is not really our friend when it comes to creating a multiplier environment, meaning we did do some research on this, and we are more likely to diminish when someone thinks and works differently than us.
I could see that.
Not necessarily different gender or, you know, ethnicity or age, but when somebody doesn't quite work and their brains work in different ways, like, it makes us cautious and a little suspicious, and pretty easy to end up down the diminisher logic of they're doing it differently than I would do it. They're thinking about it differently. Therefore, they're not going to get it done right without me. So we really have to be careful when people have different personality and mental processing styles to not end up diminishing. I know I have to work hard at this.
Right. Yeah, it's very similar between me and my husband. I think one of the examples you used in the book was about people with the Myers-Briggs type, whether they're judging or perceiving, and how that.
Oh, did I include that in the book?
Yeah, you did. So I was like, oh, yeah, that's good stuff there, because yeah, you're tackling these problems in a completely different way, and you're just wondering what is going on in that person's head. Like, why aren't they thinking the same way I'm thinking? So
Yeah.
that's a great.
Anyone I has a high J tendency on Myers-Briggs, like high judging. Like, I am probably a massive multiplier to them because their brains work the way my brain works. And I'm like, oh, they've got it. They're going to get it done. I'm hands off. They're all over it. But my P colleagues, I'm a little suspicious of all of them. Like, you're just acting so casual about all this. You're so in the moment with me, which is beautiful, but I'm just so suspicious that this is not going to be done by tomorrow morning at 8. And like, a little bit of my inner monster comes out.
But that's good to know, because then you can talk about it.
Yeah, and then we talk about it. And I've learned, like, it's just a mental handicap I have to get over. But I just have to work a little harder.
Makes sense. It reminds me that maybe I need to do some work with my husband on that, because he's more of the judger type and I'm perceiving. So
oh, okay.
That dynamic is definitely happening, and it's been 10 years and going strong.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, any final thoughts for us?
My final thoughts are that it's something I have to work at every single day. Like, I think I have a real natural multiplier side, but then I think I have an inner diminisher that comes out, and I find that if I'm just aware of it and watching for it, I can flip those diminishing tendencies into multiplier moments. But I have to constantly watch for it. But it's kind of a fun watch to stand. So I would encourage people to not read the book and think, oh, gee, am I a diminisher or so-and-so a diminisher? It's just, how do I flip accidental diminisher tendencies into multiplier moments? Because, like, the reward we get for doing that, like when we learn to lead like a multiplier by rule, like, it becomes our predominant way we lead. When we lead like a multiplier by rule, we earn the right to be a diminisher by exception, and to have our micromanaging moments, but to not actually have those turn into, for that not to create a diminishing effect, because we build the trust that people forgive our little hangups, or we can explain them away and people go like, I totally get where he's coming from. Like, cool, I understand. Like, that's your thing.
That's so encouraging, and it's inspiring too. We're all on a journey. So I appreciate you being so vulnerable with us in that moment and sharing that you too are still working towards multiplier status extraordinaire. So thank you so much, Liz. I can't tell you how much we've enjoyed having you on here today. It's just a true honor to have you join us. I know so many people in this room have been really excited just for this whole session coming up. So thank you once again from all of us.
My pleasure. Thanks for choosing the book, sharing it, and thanks for people who have read it. And if you haven't read it, like, I relieve you of any guilt or pressure to finish it or to read it. It's a busy month. If you never get to it, don't worry about it, but maybe take away this core idea. But definitely read the story about Sean, because that's one of my favorites.
Yes, that was pretty awesome. We loved it. And we have a lot of military and government in the background here too. So
Very good.
Good. Well, thank you so much.
Finish it, then I can
Thanks,
show the abstract.
That's right. Sean can shoot us the abstract. So Sean, if you'll send that to me, I will post that out to the group for the
Great.
people that need the 3-page version. This has been phenomenal. Love you guys. We've recorded this session, so we'll share it with the members of our book club group who couldn't join tonight. And happy holidays to everybody. Hope you enjoy this special time of year. Take care.
Thanks, Val.
Thanks. See ya. Bye, Liz. Have a great evening.